seeing perhaps the start of some anticipation that Vietnam does have a chance being added to the MSCI Emerging Market Index watch list. 2018 was a rather disappointing year ultimately for the Vietnam market. 2019, on the other hand, has started very well, as at the close of business today, the 21st of February. The index will be up somewhere around 8.5% on a month-to-date basis. So there's starting to be a lot of interest coming from foreign investors. It's the start of a year and you're more likely to take more risk at the beginning of the year than towards the end of the year. If we get onto the watch list, then the first thing that happens is that investors will start to take off-index bets. So if they're an emerging market investor and they can see that Vietnam is on the path to being redesignated an emerging market, then they will start to invest. When Vietnam gets added to the index, or when the announcement is made that in a year's time Vietnam would go into the index, then you start to get passive money coming into the market. The government and MSCI, I'm sure, talk to each other regularly. We did publish an article earlier this week that suggested that, or somebody had suggested to us that all Vietnam needs to do is ask MSCI to be included on the watch list, and that will happen. I don't think that's true, personally. But the issues have been with MSCI Emerging Market Inclusion that Vietnam fulfills the quantitative criteria in terms of the size and number of companies and the access to a very small number of companies. But what MSCI needs is broader access for foreigners so that the market ultimately, ideally, becomes a level playing field so that Vietnamese domestic investors and foreign investors have the same rights and the same access to the market. And that's because we have foreign ownership limits still in effect. That's still some way off, but there is starting to be a feeling that they are moving towards trying to create more access, but it is, it's a difficult process because laws have to be changed in order to enable all of the legislation to be put in line to encourage companies to remove their foreign ownership limits, essentially. And once that happens to an extent that the MSCI are happy with, then they will have sufficient reason to add Vietnam to the watch list, and then over the next year or so will enable Vietnam to fulfill the criteria that they're moving towards but perhaps haven't quite achieved yet. I think some of the difficulties, for example, in order to create a level playing field, the MSCI really wants Vietnam to release all corporate announcements in Vietnamese and in English, so bilingual announcements, so that everybody gets the same information at the same time, which is obviously a very good thing, and that does create a level playing field. But for Vietnam, at least, because the official language of Vietnam is Vietnamese, forcing companies to release announcements in English is not something they can easily do. So we think that might be fixable by making it voluntary and applying to listed companies if they choose to seek admission to one of the domestic indices, or if they're over a certain size, or if they have a certain amount of foreign ownership already, for example. Two adjustments to the emerging market index. Saudi Arabia in 2017 was put straight into the emerging market index, largely because they were planning to have the largest ever IPO in a company called Saudi Aramco. That is no longer going to happen, and obviously Saudi Arabia have more recently had some other issues in terms of their behaviour in other countries, shall we say. And then at the same time in 2017, Argentina was put onto the Emerging Market Index watch list, and unfortunately it was far too late in the economic cycle. And Argentina over the last 20, 30, 40 years has had regular economic collapses, if you like, and one of those happened not very long after it was added to the index. So, Vietnam being a country which has a very strong economy at the moment, adding it to the index while the economy is still developing and still growing would, in our opinion, would certainly be a much more successful addition. And historically, and over the 15 years that we've been investing here, the Vietnamese are very pragmatic in terms of the government. They are also very cautious. So it's not 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but it's more taking a step and waiting and seeing what impact that has on the environment, the landscape as a whole, because they may not have anticipated every impact of taking a step, and so they'll take a step and wait to see what happens before taking the next step. And so in 2015 they introduced something called Decree 60, which allowed companies to remove their foreign ownership limits as long as they didn't operate in a restricted sector. But there are too many restricted sectors to make that easy, because companies have to figure out whether they do have any business lines or the permission to engage in business lines that are on that list of 236 restricted sectors. And so we would really ideally like to see that simplified to no more than, well, we'd prefer 10, but 20 would be fine. So at least companies have a clear idea of where they stand in terms of being able to remove foreign ownership limits. And so I guess for us that's the ideal move. But the new securities law, we think, will address some of the issues that have been causing companies to be reluctant to do so. And so far there's only 35 companies out of 1,400 that have done that. And if we get to 200 or 300 that have removed limits, then I'm sure that that MSCI would take a much more optimistic view of where we're going. If Vietnam wants to be redesignated an emerging market, which it very clearly does, then it has to fulfill the criteria of MSCI, or it doesn't get put into the index. It's a very binary process. Here are the criteria, fulfill them, and you get into the index. Don't fulfill them, and you don't. So there's nothing, there's no feeling against a particular market or country, but you have to fulfill the criteria in order to qualify for inclusion. And I think that Vietnam is certainly working towards it, but there's more work to be done. And I think adding it to the watch list will encourage Vietnam to go the extra mile or 5 miles or whatever it is to get to full qualification.